So welcome to the next video in our series on the Ten Commandments. We're going to finish up the 10 with Commandments 8, 9, and 10. So the 8th commandment, do not lie or do not bear false witness, depending on the translation you use. Typically understood as lying. Bearing false witness is any kind of defaming or slanderous action that we take against our neighbor. Don't question someone's integrity or their intelligence or the value as a person as a means of making yourself look better, right? And that doesn't mean that we overlook shortcomings or flaws or sin, but that means that we don't highlight them so that we can make ourselves look better in the eyes of someone else at the expense of our neighbor. Following this commandment not only means not verbally abusing our neighbor, but making sure that we speak well of them, giving them the benefit of the doubt, and offering criticism not as an attack, but as a word of truth. The old saying, if you don't have anything nice to say, don't say it at all, really fits well here. There are, of course, legal implications for this as well, right? Testifying in court, signing official documents, making promises to other people only to fall through on them would be breaking this commandment. This commandment, like the others, has to do with the character of God and who we are as God's beloved people, right? Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. There are various passages of Scripture, Old and New Testament, that talk about God and God's work being the source and the substance of all truth and truthfulness. As people who are created by God and in the image of God, we are people who are made for the truth. And so as Christians, we understand that there is no such thing as a little white lie, or a time or a place where telling an untruth or misleading or deceiving someone else is acceptable. Even and especially when telling the truth is the hard thing to do. Especially in those moments, it's unacceptable to bear false witness to what that truth is. For example, say that two friends have had a fight and are mad at one another, right? And you're caught in the middle. They both want you to take sides. You feel like they've both contributed something to the problem, but neither one of them can see how they may be at fault. And of course, the last thing that you want to do is to make them angry at you because you've pointed out that it's not totally the other person's fault. You have something to contribute to this as well. It may be difficult to tell the truth to both of your friends, but at the end of the day, that's the best way to help one another learn that we've been made for one another. And we each bear a responsibility in helping our relationships be healthy. And this is just one example of what we call speaking the truth in love. Using the truth not as a weapon, but as a means of healing and offering wholeness and truthfulness to help strengthen our relationships. Luther looked at this commandment, don't lie, don't bear false witness, and explained it to say that we should fear and love God so that we may not deceitfully lie, betray, slander, or defame our neighbor, but defend them, think and speak well of them, and interpret their actions in the best possible light. And so, of course, it's important that we speak the truth, that we don't lie, because in a lie, the trust that's formed in our relationships is broken, and there's a sense of betrayal, right? And like we've said, lies kill. They separate us from our neighbor. But notice a few other things that are mixed in here. Luther suggests that we not slander or defame our neighbor. Instead, though, we should defend our neighbor to others and interpret their actions in the best possible light. Like violence or the misuse of sex, our words can kill people and chip away at their dignity as beloved members of God's creation. When Jesus says love your enemies, he doesn't just mean treat them well. He means learn to speak well of them to others and interpret their actions in the best possible light. And I think that that's one of the hardest things for us to do. To not be skeptical about why people do the things that they do. Right? If someone gives you a gift out of the blue, the first thing you probably think of is, well, what are they trying to get out of me? I know personally, sometimes I start to wonder what they're trying to butter me up for so that they can take advantage of me later on down the road. But that kind of skepticism also keeps us at a distance and separates us from our neighbor, the neighbor that we are called to know and to love. Now, of course, that doesn't mean we aren't cautious about how people may be trying to manipulate us or deceive others, but this commandment suggests that we shouldn't start in that place. We try to allow people the benefit of the doubt and to trust that they take their own word and actions as seriously as we take our own promises. Starting off on an even playing field, that we both view ourselves as putting our best foot forward. Because after all, we belong to God, and God is the one who speaks that truth and life and creation into being with a word. And so when it comes to not lying, not bearing false witnesses, again, it comes back to the character of God. God is the one who speaks truth, who makes us for the truth, and who encourages our relationships to be founded on a level of trust and truthfulness. So at this time, pause, take a moment to talk about what you've heard in the discussion questions on your handout. And when you come back, we're going to tackle Commandments 9 and 10 together. Welcome back. Like I said, we're going to take Commandments 9 and 10 together because they both deal with coveting. Coveting, in its simplest understanding, means having the desire to possess something. Remember, I think we talked about in the video for the first commandment, Luther said of sin and idolatry that to which your heart clings the most, whatever it is your heart desires the most, that is your God. It's a desire so strong that it leads us to action and is typically thought of as a desire that leads us to stealing something away from someone else. A few examples: say you want the newest iPhone or video game system or a new car or a new house. There's no problem with upgrading what you have, right? With wanting a better quality of life for yourself. But the question is, why do we want those new things? Is it because what we currently have no longer works for us? Or is it because we're trying to keep up with a trend or just think that we have to have the newest, shiniest thing? Particularly when we look at friends or neighbors who seem to have better stuff than we do, coveting is desiring that thing, whatever it is, so much that we're willing to do almost anything to have it for ourselves, almost like an obsession. And so coveting can quite possibly lead us to lie, steal, commit adultery, or even kill. Luther explains the 9th commandment by saying that we should fear and love God so that we may not craftily seek to get our neighbor's inheritance or house, their property, and obtain it by a show of justice and right, either by stealing it away or legally. But we should help and be a service to our neighbor to help them in keeping their property. When it comes to coveting possessions, the physical things that belong to our neighbor, their house, their car, whatever, it's destructive because it places our own greed, our desire for that thing, over the need of our neighbor. Using ill-gotten means, using the legal processes at our fingertips, using slander or holding a debt over someone's head to obtain what our neighbor has for ourselves, even though it may be legal, breaks this commandment. For this, Luther uses the example of people arguing over a will or a legal inheritance, saying that some people will use every possible means that they have to build a case that has the appearance of legality, when all that person is really concerned with is the stuff, not necessarily the wishes of the deceased or the truth. Instead, we are called to help our neighbor maintain what God has blessed them with. If we say that God has blessed us with our gifts, our resources, our property, everything that we have, for the sake of being a blessing to our neighbor, then we should help to build a relationship with others so that they begin to see and use their gifts in this way too. Not as something to hoard up for themselves, but as gifts from God for the blessing of others. Which then brings us into the other part of a covetous relationship, the relationship between our neighbor and their spouse, servants, livestock, or anything else that is their neighbors. Luther explains that the 10th commandment means we should fear and love God so that we may not estrange, separate, force, or entice away our neighbor's wife or husband, servants or cattle or livestock, but urge them to stay and diligently do their duty. This one, of course, deals with relationships, right, as separate from physical property. Envying a person's relationship to the extent that we undermine our neighbor and try to seize them as our own destroys community. Jesus, in the Sermon on the Mount, links the sixth commandment against adultery with this type of covetousness. You've heard it said, don't commit adultery, but I say to you that everyone who looks at a woman or a man with lust has already committed adultery with that person in his or her heart. That desire can lead to some destructive stuff, right? And think about the way that people obsess over celebrities or athletes in unhealthy ways, devoting all of their time and energy into craving a relationship with this person to the point that it consumes their entire lives. We don't live in a society where slavery is acceptable, and not many of us have personal servants, but what about our friendships with other people? I want this person's attention and affection all to myself, so I'm going to make everyone else look horrible in their eyes so that they only want to hang out with me. Cattle or livestock, right? These were the means by which people in the ancient world made their living, and so it could be thought of in terms of our neighbor's means of employment. But maybe for some of you, it's another person's pet. You know, I really like that dog from up the street. I think I can do a better job of loving them more than my neighbor does. I may just snatch him up one day, make my neighbor think he ran away. Or if you actually are trading in livestock, right? Offering a shady deal for a trade causes us to steal away what belongs to our neighbor and claim it for ourselves. It's hard to keep these kind of desires under control, especially when we feel hurt or harmed because we may not experience the relationship that we see someone else enjoying, knowing and trusting that God built us for one another and for healthy relationships. But of course, the problems begin to pile on if we're willing to do deceitful, harmful, or shady things to achieve them. Luther gives us some advice on all this, and it's advice that is hard to follow, but which ultimately helps us to become more self-aware of our covetous desires and to live a fuller, healthier, happier life in fellowship with other people. Instead of driving a wedge between people or cutting ourselves off from them completely, we're called and empowered by God to help our neighbor foster healthy relationships with all who surround them. When we're recognizing that we are coveting someone or something, and that a person isn't really in danger, isn't being mistreated by someone else, when we realize that what we really want is that person or that thing for ourselves, it does more good to find a way to strengthen that person's relationship with others than to try to drive a wedge and split them apart, or for us to step away altogether, because it doesn't change our desire. These 9th and 10th commandments are about being on guard against allowing ourselves to fall into temptation again and again and again. It's not that we won't be tempted, right? We can't control our desires on our own. But our desires can be shaped and redirected through prayer, through worship and fellowship with our neighbors in Christian community, and by clinging to these commandments and following them as faithfully as possible. God has given us these resources to help refocus our desire away from the person or thing that causes our coveting, investing instead into God's goodness, God's abundant provision for our lives, and God's desire for life for us and for the building up of strong, faithful communities. In a way, the 9th and 10th commandment mirrors the first commandment. Don't let your desire be for your neighbor's property, material goods, or relationships. Let your desire be for God, who brought Israel out of Egypt and who promises to bring us out of the grave, just as he raised Jesus from the dead. Everything between have no other gods and do not covet can be wrapped up in who God is and what God does for us, and how God works through these commandments to change our lives for the better. But more on that in our next video, which is a conclusion to the entire table of the 10 Commandments.